Hello, my name's Chris West. I'm a senior researcher and deputy director at the York Centre of the Stockholm Environment Institute, or SEI, based at the University of York. And my research focuses on the impacts of international trade, and in particular, the impacts associated with commodities that link to deforestation and to land use change. Today, I'll be briefly speaking about the importance of trade-linked land use change emissions. So as I mentioned, I'm from the Stockholm Environment Institute, or SEI, which is an international non-profit research organization focused on sustainable policy and practice. And some of the data that I'll talk about today arises from work that we've been doing along with the UK's Joint Nature Conservation Committee, or JNCC. And the JNCC is the public body that advises the UK government, as well as the devolved governments, on UK-wide and international nature conservation issues. So I'm here to tell you about another part of the emissions story. So direct emissions, like those that you just heard about, arising from the burning of fossil fuels to provide energy for manufacturing, for production, and for transport, aren't the only way that trade contributes to carbon emissions. Carbon is also stored in trees and other plants, and a lot is also stored in the soil. And this carbon can be lost when we replace the natural plants in our environment. So particularly if we replace habitats with smaller and more spaced out plants, for example, when we cut down a natural forest and use the space to grow food. And in many areas of the world, forests and other natural areas are cleared to make space for agriculture by burning, meaning that not only are we replacing things with plants that are storing much less carbon, but also that all of the carbon that was stored there originally is released straight into the atmosphere. Additionally, the drainage of or disturbance to the soil can also lead to the soil releasing and storing lower levels of carbon. And it's estimated that between 13 and 20% of total greenhouse gas emissions come from these land use change effects rather than from burning fossil fuels directly. Now, most of the land use change in question is linked to farmland expanding into areas that were previously forests, grasslands, or other natural environments. And you can see here just how much farmland area has expanded over time. And particularly this is the case in the last 100 years or so. Now, whilst a lot of what is produced on this newly converted land goes towards supporting populations in the countries where those materials are being produced, a large part also ends up being sold into the international trade system. So this might end up in our plates or in our wardrobes here in the UK. So when we're trading products such as food, clothes, and wood, we need to understand the carbon emissions they have caused because of this land use change. For example, in the year 2021 alone, according to the data that we've been collaborating on with the JNCC, the UK was responsible for around 31,000 hectares of deforestation around the world because of what was imported and used here in the UK. And that's equivalent to more than 57,000 football fields. And this led to the emissions of 5.7 million tons of carbon dioxide, and that's equivalent to flying from London to New York almost 9 million times. Now, these impacts are especially linked to our supply chains originating in the areas shown in the darker colors in this map. So that's locations such as Brazil and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And they're also especially linked to supply chains involving cattle, cassava, soy, maize, and palm oil. Understanding the specifics around where our impacts come from can help us to design and to prioritize solutions and to identify partner countries or industries to try to work with. Overall, understanding the emissions from trade can be very complex. The emissions from transport, the emissions from energy at each stage of the production process, and the emissions that I've just talked about from land use change all need to be considered as part of the mix. And it also can be difficult to predict what would happen if we try to change things, for example, by producing more here in the UK rather than importing. Now, scientists have done studies on this and found that it varies a lot depending on what you're producing and how you're producing it. So, for example, one study found that whilst potatoes, beef, and apples led to lower carbon emissions when produced in the UK, this was not the case for tomatoes, strawberries, poultry, and lamb, even when you consider the carbon emitted during the transportation phase. Ultimately, though, we must bring together all of the knowledge that we have so that we can make more informed decisions to address the ways in which our consumption habits and our economies contribute to these emissions overall. Thanks very much for listening.